The summer of 1557 was unusually quiet in Chelsea. The air carried the scent of grass and faint smoke from the nearby chimneys, soft and steady. Birds drifted lazily across the sky, and the garden outside swayed gently in the warm breeze. Inside a modest country house, an old woman sat by a window, her hands folded in her lap. She stared at the fading sunlight, watching shadows stretch across the stone floor. That woman was Anne of Cleves, once the Queen of England. Now she was almost invisible. Time had pulled her out of the spotlight, leaving her name to float quietly in history, barely remembered. Yet there she sat, alive, breathing, existing in a world that no longer noticed her. It had not always been this way. Years ago, Anne had crossed the sea, arriving in England with the promise of a crown. Henry VIII had awaited her, a king both powerful and terrifying, a man whose smile could charm and whose anger could destroy. Their marriage, arranged for political reasons, was meant to cement alliances, to shape the fate of nations. But fate had other plans. The king had seen her, studied her face, and then turned cold. His heart, it seemed, had not belonged to her. Within months, their marriage was annulled, and Anne was spared the cruel ends that had fallen upon some of Henry's other wives. There was no execution, no exile, no fiery scandal, only a strange, quiet peace, a peace built on being invisible. In this house, she was free from danger. But freedom came with a price: loneliness. The corridors echoed with silence. The walls remembered the laughter and whispers of servants long gone. The sunlight that fell across her garden was gentle, but even it could not chase away the shadows that gathered inside her mind. She had watched the court from afar as kings and queens passed in triumph and tragedy. Henry himself had died, leaving a trail of wives who had suffered under his temper and ambition. Some had burned in the flames of scandal, others had vanished quietly, like whispers in the wind. Anne survived them all, and yet surviving brought no comfort. The servants moved softly around her, carrying trays of tea, tidying the room, their voices hushed. They whispered prayers at her bedside, bending over her frailty, hoping to shield her from the world's forgetfulness. No messenger came from the palace. No royal physician checked her pulse. England had already moved on. She was alone. And yet, she carried herself with dignity. There was a rhythm to her days, quiet and steady. She tended the garden in the mornings, her fingers brushing over herbs and flowers as if seeking solace in the life that grew beneath her hands. She prayed in the afternoons, kneeling with her rosary clutched tightly, whispering words meant for God alone. In the evenings, she read letters from distant friends and family, the inked words a faint echo of the world she had once known. Anne's life had become a series of small, careful motions. She rose with the sun, ate her meals in silence, walked through her rooms as if tracing the contours of memory itself. Outside, the world buzzed with politics, gossip, and the ambitions of those who still remembered the crown. Inside, she breathed slowly, her presence almost a ghostly shadow in the home she had made her own. Illness crept in like a slow tide. Her breathing grew shallow, her hands trembled, and sometimes late at night she would lie awake listening to the soft creak of floorboards and the distant sound of church bells. Each toll of the bell marked a passing moment, a life fading into memory. She had survived the dangers of kings and court intrigue, yet now she faced a final enemy quietly, without the clamor of witnesses or the comfort of family. Still, there was resilience in her quiet. Anne of Cleves had learned over decades that strength did not always roar. Sometimes strength was the soft persistence of breath, the steady heart that continued even when no one noticed. She had been a queen, briefly, but her title now was of a different sort. She was a survivor. Her mind wandered, as it often did, to the sea that had carried her to England. She remembered the waves lashing against the ship, the uncertain excitement and fear of a young woman stepping into a world so foreign, so full of expectation. She had imagined triumph, love, a place among the great and powerful. Instead, she had been given survival and a life hidden from notice. Survival, she realized, was sometimes a lonelier fate than death. The bells of Chelsea rang softly that summer morning. Their sound drifted through the air, gentle, unhurried, as if they too understood the hush of this house. Anne listened to them, her gaze lingering on the window pane where sunlight reflected faintly. Each note felt like a question, a small echo of history. How did the queen who survived everyone, who had outlived kings and queens alike, end up dying alone? She thought of the past, of the life that had been hers for only a moment. The bright gowns, the portraits, the fleeting recognition of the court, all had faded. Now, the quiet was her companion. And yet, in that quiet, there was also freedom. She could move through her days without fear, without expectation. She could breathe slowly and deliberately in a world that had once demanded everything of her. Her final days passed with this gentle rhythm. The sun rose and set, the garden bloomed and withered, servants moved silently, attending to her needs with devotion. And Anne, the forgotten queen, remained, a figure at once fragile and enduring, a woman who had known rejection and still carried herself with grace. When the moment came, as all moments do, it was as quiet as the life she had lived. The bells continued to toll, indifferent to the passing of one who had once been a queen. And in that silence, Anne of Cleves slipped from the world she had known, leaving behind only a memory, faint but unbroken, a whisper of survival in a history that had almost forgotten her. She died as she had lived, quietly, with dignity, and entirely alone. Yet in that solitude, there was also a strange, solemn beauty. She had escaped the violence and fury that claimed so many around her. She had lived longer than some kings and queens. And though she left no grand legacy, no triumphant conquest, she left something equally rare, a testament to the human capacity to endure, to survive, and to find peace even when the world has moved on. And so, the question lingers still in the echo of Chelsea's bells. How does a queen vanish into silence, yet leave a story that refuses to die? How does survival, quiet and unnoticed, become a form of quiet triumph? Anne of Cleves, the forgotten queen, had all the answers, and yet she took them with her, leaving the world only her memory and the haunting truth that even a life unnoticed can still be remarkable. It all began with a painting, a portrait of Anne of Cleves, carefully crafted, delicate, and precise. Henry VIII had commissioned it while she was still across the sea. When he looked at it, he smiled. He believed he knew what awaited him, a queen, a companion, a woman who could serve the crown and the kingdom. But when she arrived, standing before him in flesh and blood, the illusion shattered. The king's heart turned cold. Something in her appearance, or perhaps in the way he imagined her, did not match the canvas he had studied so closely. And in that moment, a marriage arranged for politics, for alliances, for power, was doomed before it truly began. The wedding itself was awkward. Courtiers whispered behind hands, noting the stiffness in her bow, the hesitation in his smile. The union was never consummated, a private truth that both parties understood. Within 6 months, Henry demanded an annulment. Anne did not resist. She accepted it quietly, calmly, as if she had always known that her role in the king's story would be brief. And yet, in that briefness, she survived. Many of Henry's wives had faced danger, even death. Anne walked away. Remarkably, the king, for reasons not entirely clear, granted her the title, the king's beloved sister. He gave her lands, income, and a life of relative comfort. She was protected. She was free. But freedom came with its own kind of pain. The crown she had worn for a fleeting moment was borrowed, a temporary crown that left her both honored and humiliated. She watched Henry marry again and again, each new wife a reminder of the life she had been denied. She attended court events, smiled politely, and took her place at tables carefully arranged by protocol. And all the while she carried a private grief, quiet and constant, a shadow behind every polite bow and careful word. Her letters reveal more than courtly appearances could show. In ink and paper, she let herself breathe. She wrote with a tone softened by acceptance and by resignation. There is gratitude there for her safety, for her freedom, but there is also loneliness. She was a queen without a crown, a wife without a husband, a woman whose life had been shaped by the ambitions of men far more powerful than she could ever have imagined. Anne had been traded for peace, not for love. Her marriage was a contract, a political chess move that spared her life but left her identity hollowed. The girl who had crossed the sea, who had dreamed of influence, of respect, of perhaps affection, was now a quiet observer. She had a place at court, yet she belonged fully to no one. Still, she endured. There is something remarkable in that endurance. To survive a king like Henry VIII, to navigate a court so full of intrigue, danger, and expectation required strength, and Anne of Cleves had it, though she carried it lightly. She was careful not to draw attention, not to make waves. She was polite, gracious, and in a way, invisible. Even in her invisibility, there were moments that must have stung. The whispered jokes at court, the sidelong glances, the subtle way the world reminded her of her brief, failed queenhood. She could not reclaim what was lost. She could only continue, step by careful step, through a life designed by others, yet survived by her own courage. Yet Anne's story is not one of bitterness. She did not rage against her fate. She accepted it, adapted to it, and lived with a dignity that seems almost impossible under such circumstances. Many would have crumbled under the humiliation. Many would have sought revenge or faded into despair. Anne carried on with a quiet grace. She had been unwanted, but she was unbroken. Her title, the king's beloved sister, might have sounded odd to outsiders, but in it lay a protection, a recognition that she was different from the rest. She had escaped the peril that swallowed others, and though it was a bittersweet recognition, it was still life. And life, she understood, was something to be treasured. Even in her quiet days, she must have remembered the sea voyage, the excitement and fear, the moment of stepping onto foreign soil to meet a man she barely knew. And she had survived. That survival, simple and unremarkable to the world, was her first true victory. The marriage that never was had shaped her life in ways no crown or title ever could. It had brought rejection, yes, humiliation, yes, but it had also brought freedom. Freedom to exist, to walk through her days safely, to live long enough to see kings rise and fall, to live long enough to witness history without being destroyed by it. Henry married again. He married others, pursued power, and reshaped the course of England. Anne watched quietly, sometimes attending events, sometimes retreating to the solitude of her chambers. She was present, yet apart, participating in court life while remaining untouched by its storms. In that paradox lies her remarkable humanity. Anne of Cleves was a queen, briefly, a wife, briefly, but a survivor always. She had lost love, she had lost title, she had lost the life she imagined, and yet she had gained something rarer, a life entirely her own, shaped not by violence or fear, but by endurance, patience, and quiet resolve. Her life after the annulment was a strange balance of visibility and invisibility. She was known, yet overlooked, respected, yet forgotten. And in that tension, she found a way to exist with dignity. She had been a pawn, a political arrangement, a painting misjudged by a king, yet she had outlived all the chaos that defined Henry's reign. And in that quiet survival, there is a lesson that echoes across the centuries. Sometimes the greatest triumph is not conquest or power, but endurance, the ability to continue with grace when the world has rejected you. Anne of Cleves, the girl who crossed the sea for a crown, had survived a king who could have destroyed her. She had survived history itself. Her marriage never brought love. It never brought the life she might have dreamed of. But it gave her time to witness, time to reflect, and time to grow into a woman who would one day walk through the shadows of a court no longer hers and emerge, still dignified, still human, still alive. The painting that had started it all remained in the memory of those who saw it. But the woman behind the painting, Anne of Cleves, would live far beyond the expectations of any king. She would endure quietly until the world itself forgot to look. And in that endurance, she became more than a queen. She became a survivor, a witness, a woman who carried her dignity through rejection and humiliation, and who learned that survival itself could be the truest form of strength. Years passed. The noise and chaos of court faded into memory. Kings died, queens were crowned and unmade, and England moved on, relentless in its rhythms. But Anne of Cleves remained. She had outlived the court's fury, the ambitions, the scandals. And yet, surviving had brought a different kind of trial: silence. She moved to a quiet estate in Chelsea, a place far from the pomp and spectacle she had once known. The house was modest, its walls lined with portraits of people long gone, their eyes following her as if they remembered more than the living ever could. Outside, her garden flourished with herbs, roses, and small fruit trees. It was alive. Inside, she felt the weight of absence. Anne's days followed gentle routines. Morning light spilled across the floors, catching dust in golden beams. She tended the garden with care, her hands brushing soil and petals as if searching for life to fill the quiet around her. She knelt to pray, holding her rosary with fingers that had once grasped crowns and letters of state. And she wrote letters to Princess Mary, to friends, to those she still loved. Her handwriting was precise, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of a life shaped by both loss and survival. Visitors grew fewer over the years. Letters arrived slowly, often unsigned, carrying news from distant lands or the quiet acknowledgments of friends. Anne read them all, responding in the same gentle tone she had cultivated, polite, humble, loyal. Even when forgotten, she remained steadfast. She carried her dignity like a cloak, soft but unyielding, wrapping herself in a quiet loyalty that the world had long ceased to notice. Inside her house, shadows gathered, not threatening but patient. They lingered in the corners, draped across faded tapestries, curling around furniture polished by decades of careful hands. Anne moved among them, a ghost in her own home, yet fully alive in her thoughts, memories, and small acts of daily life. The once vibrant woman who had crossed the sea for a crown had become a silent witness to history. She remembered Henry, his temper, the fleeting days of her queenship. She remembered her annulment, the titles and lands she had gained, and the life she had carved for herself after rejection. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of her survival. Yet even in isolation, Anne's heart remained connected to the royal family. She wrote to Princess Mary, offering small gifts, prayers, and advice. She attended Mary's coronation, proud despite her frailty. She understood her place in the world. She was neither ruler nor consort, but a quiet presence, loyal and dignified in a realm that had mostly forgotten her. Illness arrived slowly. It crept through her body, weakening her frame and making each movement deliberate and careful. Her breathing grew shallow. Nights were long and silent, punctuated only by the whispers of servants who had grown accustomed to the weight of watching over her. She no longer moved through the house with the energy of youth, but with measured grace, aware that time was slipping through her fingers. On her bedside table, a few objects held profound significance: a rosary, a small cross, and a sealed letter. The letter remained unopened, its contents known only to Anne. Some believed it was addressed to the Queen. Others imagined it was a private confession, a prayer for forgiveness, or a final reflection of a life lived mostly in quiet. Whatever its purpose, it symbolized her inner world, private, unspoken, and entirely hers. The walls of her home were filled with memories. Portraits of Henry, of her brief moments in court, of friends and relatives long gone, watched silently as she moved among them. Sometimes she paused before them, tracing the lines of a face with her eyes, remembering conversations, gestures, or the touch of a hand long absent. In these moments, the house felt alive with the echoes of a past she could no longer change. Anne had learned to live with absence, with loss, and with silence. Her life was no longer measured by titles or recognition, but by small victories: the bloom of a rose in her garden, a letter sent in loyalty, a prayer whispered in the dark. Survival had become an art, a quiet mastery of living in a world that often overlooked her. Even as the days shortened and the light shifted, she maintained her routine. She watched the sky from her windows, noting the passage of seasons with the patience of someone who had already learned that time waits for no one. She listened to the distant tolling of church bells, each note a reminder that life was moving forward, even if she remained in place. The isolation was profound, but it was also a kind of sanctuary. There were no court intrigues, no angry kings, no whispers of scandal. There was only the rhythm of her own life, the careful tending of her home, and the steady heartbeat of someone who had survived everything the world had thrown at her. When illness worsened, Anne seemed to accept it with calm. There was no fear, only an awareness that her time was drawing near. She rested in her chambers, surrounded by the objects she had chosen, the memories she had curated, and the few loyal servants who remained by her side. And yet, even in her final days, she maintained her connection to the world beyond her walls. Her prayers were for England, for the royal family, and for those who would come after her. She had lived quietly, loyally, and with dignity. And though her presence would soon fade, the impact of her endurance, her loyalty, and her grace remained. Her letter, never opened, symbolized the life she had led, private, reflective, and often unseen. It was a final trace of her thoughts, a quiet testament to the woman who had once been queen and who had survived when others had fallen. Anne of Cleves, in the House of Quiet Shadows, embodied the paradox of survival. She was forgotten yet present, invisible yet enduring, alone yet dignified. She had lived a life shaped by the decisions of kings and the tides of history, yet she had maintained her humanity, her grace, and her quiet strength. In her final hours, the house seemed to breathe with her. The garden outside swayed in the afternoon sun. Shadows shifted gently along the walls. The portraits watched silently. And Anne, the queen who had once been borrowed by history and left behind by the world, took her last breaths in quiet dignity, leaving behind the legacy of a life endured, not for power, not for glory, but for survival itself. Her story, contained in the quiet of Chelsea, remains haunting. The House of Shadows, the garden, the unopened letter, all speak of a life lived fully in the face of abandonment, a woman whose loyalty, grace, and resilience were never fully recognized by the world, yet who left behind a silent but profound testament to the human spirit. Anne of Cleves had no crown now, no court awaited her, but she had survived, and sometimes surviving is the greatest triumph of all. July 16th, 1557. The summer morning was soft and still. Chelsea's bells rang gently across the town, their sound drifting through the gardens and streets unnoticed by most. Inside her modest country house, Anne of Cleves lay on her bed. Her breathing was shallow, her hands resting lightly atop the quilt. No king stood at her side, no royal procession awaited her, only the few servants who had tended her for years witnessed the final moments of a woman who had once been queen. Anne had lived longer than almost everyone who had shaped her life. She had outlasted Henry VIII, survived the fury of his court, and endured the passage of time that had swallowed her contemporaries. Yet, in the end, she would leave this world quietly, alone, with only memories and her faith for company. Her life had been defined by contrasts. She had arrived in England as a bride-to-be, full of hope and uncertainty, expecting triumph and perhaps love. Instead, she was rejected, humiliated, and transformed into a king's beloved sister, a title both protective and strange. She had been spared violence and death, yet in exchange, she inherited solitude. Her survival had been her only reward. And still, she had lived fully within that small, quiet world she had claimed. She tended her gardens, prayed diligently, and observed the slow passing of days with patience. Portraits of distant relatives and court figures lined the walls, silent witnesses to her resilience. Letters carefully written reflected her loyalty to the royal family, her concern for England's peace, and a quiet wisdom born from years of careful observation. Her final illness came gently, creeping through her body until each breath required effort. The servants moved softly, whispering prayers in the shadows, carrying water or food, smoothing her sheets. They were devoted to her, yet powerless to stop the inevitable. Even the distant palace had no message, no physician, no concern for the queen who had been once, briefly. England had already turned its attention elsewhere, and yet there was dignity in her final hours. Anne of Cleves had learned long ago that life, even when uncelebrated, carried its own quiet grandeur. She clasped her rosary, fingers trembling, and whispered prayers for those she had loved, for the kingdom she had served in silence, for the people she would never see again. Outside, the garden flourished, sunlight spilling over the flowers she had nurtured, a final witness to her life's work. Her will was simple: money for the poor, small gifts for her household, and prayers for England. No grand displays, no attempt to assert a legacy that had never been fully acknowledged in life. In death, she asked for nothing but dignity, respect, and remembrance in the softest form, the quiet human recognition of a life endured. When she was buried in Westminster Abbey, it was not among queens who had ruled or shaped history by their presence, but near them, close enough to hear their echoes. Her name would be recorded, her existence noted, but few would understand the life she had lived in between. Few would grasp the courage required to survive rejection, invisibility, and abandonment and still maintain grace. Anne's legacy was not one of conquest, influence, or scandal. It was the quiet, unassuming triumph of survival. She had come to a foreign land expecting love and power. She had found rejection, yet she never allowed bitterness to define her. Instead, she cultivated loyalty, faith, and dignity. In life, she was unseen. In death, her story whispered through the corridors of history, a reminder that strength can take many forms. The objects she left behind tell a story too. The rosary, a small cross, and the unopened letter, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a confession, symbolize the private depth of her life. They speak of a woman who experienced loss and rejection but remained true to herself and to her principles. They speak of silence, yes, but also of thoughtfulness, introspection, and quiet heroism. And in this, there is an almost poetic justice. The queen who had never truly ruled, who had been unwanted, and who had endured centuries of history in the background, left the world with a testament to her humanity. Her story is not one of political maneuvering, fiery drama, or scandalous intrigue. It is the story of the human heart, of endurance, of grace under circumstances no one else could have imagined. The Chelsea bells continued to toll long after she had breathed her last. They rang over gardens she had tended, rooms she had inhabited, a house filled with memories and shadows. And in those echoes there remains a haunting question. How does a queen survive rejection, obscurity, and time, and still leave a legacy that speaks to the quiet strength of a human life? Anne of Cleves answers it softly. Through survival, through loyalty, through patience, through dignity. She demonstrates that life need not be marked by grandeur to be meaningful, and that a story can be profound even when it unfolds in silence. In the end, she found a peace that the world had never given her in life. She found it in her quiet home, in the love of loyal servants, in the bloom of a rose, and in her faith. And though she died alone, she left behind a life that whispers across centuries, a story of grace, resilience, and the remarkable power of simply enduring. The queen who died alone reminds us of a truth often overlooked. Survival itself can be a victory, and sometimes the quietest life sung, the one unnoticed by most, is the one that speaks the loudest to the human heart. Anne of Cleves, the forgotten queen, the bride who was rejected, the woman who endured in silence. She lived, she survived, and in doing so, she wrote a history of her own making, one not of crowns or battles, but of human dignity. And so her story ends, not with a roar, but with a quiet echo, a bell tolling across time, a reminder that to survive, to endure, to live fully in the face of rejection is itself a kind of triumph no one can ever take away.